Hello, so this is the continuation of topic 7.1, the introduction to natural selection. So in the first part of our presentation, I introduced you to Darwin's theory of natural selection. And in that theory, there are four main topics that we want to look at. The first one is variation. So in other words, in the population, there is different characteristics. And as I mentioned before, if you look at the human population, we have lots of differences. Different hair color, different eye color, different heights, different skin color. So these are variations within the population. The second concept in Darwin's theory is the idea of competition. Now, it is known that individuals overproduce and individuals need resources. There are a finite number of resources in the population, and so therefore the individuals are going to compete for those resources. The ones that are more successful are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce more offspring. This concept of competition is where the theory survival of the fittest that many of you know come from. The third concept is adaptation. Individuals with beneficial adaptations are more likely to survive and pass on these genes. So as I mentioned, there is variation in the population, and as I also mentioned, there is competition. Variation and competition means that some are going to be better adapted to the environment. Remember, once again, it's the environment that chooses the winners or losers. In the first presentation, I talked about the different colors of beetles, the red beetles and the green beetles. The red beetles had a selective advantage, such that the birds preferred the green beetles. Therefore, there was a population shift from the green being the prominent color in the population to the red beetles. That is what we call an evolution, a change in the characteristics of the population. The environment selects the winners and losers. And the fourth and final concept in Darwin's theory of natural selection is in fact the idea of selection. Over many generations, there is a change in the allele frequency or the characteristics, and that's where we see this idea of evolution coming from. So as I mentioned before, natural selection is actually a driver or a mechanism that we see pushing evolution of a population. Now in the last slide I mentioned the idea of adaptation. Now I just want to be careful. Natural selection causes populations to become adaptive or evolve or increasingly well situated to the environment over time. As I mentioned before, it is the environment that chooses the individuals that have the characteristics that are more advantageous, such that these are the ones that are going to survive, and these are the individuals that are going to reproduce. Only way that individuals are going to be selected for is that they have an existing characteristic, and that characteristic can be inherited. Just like you know that your characteristics come from your biological mother and father, your eye color, your hair color. In this diagram right here, you can see two different foxes. On the left, that's the Arctic fox. On the right, that is the Arctic fox. On the left there, you can see the desert fox. The desert fox is very distinguishable by his very large ears. And then on the right, quite compare and contrast, is the Arctic fox. Notice that the Arctic fox has those small, stubby little ears. Now it's the environment that chooses the individuals that have the large ears in the desert, because those large ears allows the desert fox to cool down in that hot sun. They almost act like a radiator on your car. Now our Arctic fox can't have those large ears, otherwise he'd get frostbitten. So the environment has selected for those short stubby ears on the Arctic fox. And as it says on my slide, adaptations enhance an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in the specific environments the individual finds themselves in. For instance, the desert fox would not survive in the Arctic. His poor ears would freeze off. So, once again, the environment selects the winners or losers. As I mentioned earlier, evolutionary fitness is measured by reproductive success. In other words, the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce will dictate or determine the amount of genetic contribution it makes to the next generation. Now we'll talk more about the idea of contributing your genes to the next generation, but that is the concept that we're going to follow in the next couple of. Last and not least, we want to talk about the concept of both the biotic and environmental factors that contribute to the direction of the population evolution. So there are three ways that natural selection can affect a population. The first one is what we call directional selection. So you'll notice in this example and the next following two that the original population is demonstrated by that dotted little line. In this situation, we have a selection against the extreme. So let's consider this to be beak sizes in our birds of the Galapagos Islands. On the left-hand side there are the small beaks. On the right-hand side are the large beaks. So let's say that in this example we had a very wet season, and what it caused is birds that had large beaks to have more food, and the birds that had the smaller beaks weren't able to compete with the larger beaked birds. And so you can see in this example, over generation after generation after generation, the smaller beaked birds were eliminated from the population. They no longer had an advantage compared to the larger beaked birds. That's what we call directional selection. The next example we have here is called disruptive selection. You'll notice here our selective pressure is focused on the average of the population. So once again, if we look at beak sizes, let's say on the left-hand side those are birds with small beaks, and on the right-hand side those are birds with large beaks. So in this example, maybe the small beaked birds have the advantage to eating the nuts, where the large beaked birds have the advantage because they can eat the insects. However, birds in the middle can't compete with the small beaked birds for the small food, and the birds in the middle can't compete with the large beaked birds for that food source. Therefore, the birds that have the middle sized beak are going to be selected against and will be eliminated from the population. So this is what we call disruptive selection. This will actually lead to two different species, and we'll discuss that concept later in this unit. And the third and final example of selection is called the stabilizing selection. So in this example, the extremes are eliminated, such that in this example it's best to be average. So let's use an example such as human weight of babies. Now, most babies are born at an average size, such that babies that are too small are usually premature, and therefore their chances of survival are much less. Whereas babies that are too large have a lot of complications during the birthing process, and their chance of survival, once again, is very low. And over generation after generation after generation, what that results in is a population of babies being born that are around a certain average. So this once again is called selective stabilization. And in all three of these situations, the environmental pressures lead to the differential reproduction. So, in summary, we started off with the concept of natural selection. Once again, natural selection is driven by variation in the population. So we see our bug population, we have green bugs and we have red bugs. We have a variation amongst the population. Heredity. Heredity deals with the concept of passing those genes on to our offspring. So just like you and myself, we received our traits from our biological parents. I have blue eyes. I received that from my mother and my father. And the last concept that drives natural selection is this idea of natural or differential reproduction, or the selection. As demonstrated in the diagram, because the birds, which are acting as our environmental pressure, choose to eliminate our green beetles, our red beetles have a selective advantage. And over generation after generation after generation, the green ones are going to be selected against because the red ones have a selective advantage. Therefore, we're going to see a population shift, which we describe as evolution. If our environmental pressures were to change, say for example we have a bird that doesn't like green beetles but maybe prefers red beetles, once again we would see a shift in our population. In that situation, our red beetles would have the advantage. Maybe our green beetles now have the advantage.